You finally awakened. You had the breakthrough, the expansion, the shift in consciousness everyone talks about. And now you're waiting for the promised transformation, the peace, the clarity, the enlightened life. But instead, you're facing something nobody warned you about. Your life is falling apart. Your relationships are ending. You're more confused than ever. And you're wondering, did I do something wrong? Is this even awakening? Carl Jung discovered that what happens after spiritual awakening is nothing like what spiritual teachers promise. Not because awakening is fake, but because the real work begins after the breakthrough, not before. And what Jung observed happening to people post-awakening will completely change how you understand this journey. Because the awakening experience is just the beginning. What comes after is where everything actually transforms. Today I'm revealing what Jung said really happens after spiritual awakening. Not the marketed version, but the actual psychological process. And if you're post-awakening and struggling, this will explain why everything feels harder instead of easier. Here's what Jung understood that changes everything. Spiritual awakening isn't the destination, it's the demolition. The breakthrough everyone seeks is actually a breakthrough through your old psychological structures. And what spiritual teachers don't tell you is that after you break through, you're left standing in the rubble of your former life with no idea how to rebuild. Jung called this the post-awakening crisis. The awakening experience, the expanded consciousness, the mystical insight, the ego dissolution, that's dramatic but temporary. What follows is months or years of integrating what happened. And integration looks nothing like enlightenment. It looks like confusion, disorientation, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding your entire life from a completely different consciousness level. Most people experiencing this think they've failed at awakening. They had the breakthrough but can't maintain the state. They touched expanded consciousness but fell back into ordinary life. But Jung insisted. This isn't failure. This is the actual process. The awakening experience breaks you open. What comes after is learning to live from that opening. And that learning is where real transformation happens. The first thing that happens post-awakening will shock you. Jung's first observation. After awakening, everything you built from your old consciousness starts collapsing. Not metaphorically, literally. Your career doesn't fit anymore. Your relationships feel wrong. Your goals seem meaningless. Your lifestyle feels unbearable. Everything structured by who you were before, awakening begins dismantling itself. Think about what awakening does. It shifts your consciousness to a completely different level, but your life, your job, your relationships, your home, your daily routines was all built from your previous consciousness. And structures built from one consciousness level can't be maintained from a different consciousness level. They're incompatible. One of Jung's patients described this collapse. Within 6 months of my awakening, my marriage ended. I quit my career. I moved cities. Not because I decided to change everything, because I couldn't maintain my old life anymore. My awakened consciousness couldn't sustain structures built by my unawakened consciousness. Everything fell apart. Jung said this was normal. The old life has to collapse before the new one can form. This is what Jung meant by the necessary destruction. You're not sabotaging your life. Your awakened consciousness is incompatible with your pre-awakening life. The structures have to fall so new ones aligned with your current consciousness can emerge. But experiencing this collapse feels like your life is ending. You'll recognize this if everything you built suddenly feels wrong. If you're walking away from things that used to define you. if your entire life is unraveling and you can't stop it. This isn't failure. It's the natural consequence of consciousness shifting while life structures remain unchanged. But external collapse is just the visible part. The second thing happens internally. After awakening, you experience prolonged identity crisis. The awakening experience dissolves your ego temporarily. But what nobody tells you is that ego doesn't just rebuild itself automatically. You spend months or years not knowing who you are, what you want, or how to be. And this identity void is terrifying. Before awakening, you had a stable identity. I'm this type of person who wants these things and lives this way. That identity was constructed, but it provided stability. Awakening reveals the construction and dissolves it. But Jung observed that new authentic identity doesn't emerge immediately. There's a long gap where you're nobody. One of Jung's analysans described this. For 2 years after my awakening, I couldn't answer basic questions. What do you want to do? I don't know. Who are you? I don't know. My old identity had dissolved, but no new identity had formed. I was just awareness without a stable self. Functioning was nearly impossible. Jung said this identity void was necessary. The new self was forming beneath consciousness, but it took time. This is what Jung meant by the death and rebirth cycle. Your old identity dies in awakening, but rebirth, the formation of new authentic identity, takes months or years. And the time between death and rebirth is the void. You're dead but not yet reborn. And that void is unbearable. You'll recognize this if you can't make decisions anymore. If people ask what you want and you genuinely don't know. If you feel like you're acting a part rather than being anyone real. This isn't confusion. It's the absence of identity while new identity slowly forms. But identity void creates another problem. The third thing happens socially. Here's what Jung observed. After awakening, you can't relate to your old life anymore. Not just that you don't want to, you literally can't. Your consciousness has changed so fundamentally that everything familiar feels alien. Your friends seem like strangers. Your interests seem pointless. Your old self seems like a different person you no longer recognize. Think about consciousness as a frequency. Before awakening, you operated at a certain frequency. You connected with people, activities, and environments on that frequency. But awakening changes your frequency. You're vibrating at a completely different rate now. And trying to engage with your old life feels like forcing incompatible systems to interact. One of Jung's patients described this alienation. I couldn't relate to my friends anymore, not from judgment, from genuine inability to connect. They were talking about things that seemed meaningless to me, living in ways I couldn't understand anymore. I wasn't better than them, I was different, and the difference created unbridgeable gap. Jung said, post-awakening alienation was one of the hardest parts. You lose connection to everything familiar, and have to find new connections aligned with your changed consciousness. This is what Jung called the loneliness of transformation. You've outgrown your old life, but haven't found your new one yet. You're in between worlds, can't go back, but don't know how to go forward. And this in-between space is profoundly isolating. You'll notice you've pulled away from everyone you knew. Social situations feel unbearable. You're spending more time alone, not from choice, but from inability to connect at your old frequency anymore. This isn't antisocial. It's the isolation that happens while consciousness adjusts to new levels. But social incompatibility is just one layer. The fourth thing affects something even more fundamental. If you're post-awakening and experiencing collapse, identity void, and alienation, Jung would say, you're not failing. This is what actually happens after awakening. The breakthrough was just the beginning. What you're experiencing now is the real transformation. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Now, these final aspects reveal what this is all preparing you for. Jung's fourth observation. After awakening, you enter what he called the integration phase, months or years of processing, consolidating, and integrating the consciousness shift you experienced. This phase isn't dramatic. It's slow, often boring, sometimes painful work of aligning your entire being with your expanded consciousness. Think about what happened during awakening. You touched dimensions of consciousness you'd never accessed. You saw through illusions you'd always believed. You experienced yourself as something beyond ego. But that experience was temporary. Integration is making that temporary experience into permanent transformation. One of Jung's analyses described integration. After the awakening high wore off, I spent 2 years doing what Jung called integration work, processing old trauma through new consciousness, rebuilding identity authentically, creating new life structures, learning to function at my new consciousness level. It wasn't exciting. It was grinding, daily work of actually becoming what I'd briefly experienced. Jung said, most people skip integration. They chase the next awakening experience instead of integrating the one they had. This is what Jung meant by the valley after the peak. The awakening experience is the peak, intense, dramatic, memorable, but you can't live on peaks. Integration is the valley, where you do the actual work of transforming, and valleys are long, unglamorous, and require patience. You'll recognize integration if you're not having dramatic experiences, but doing quiet, internal work. If you're processing old material through new awareness. If you're slowly, painfully rebuilding your life from different consciousness. This isn't regression. It's the real work. But integration requires something specific. The fifth thing reveals what you're actually building. After awakening and integration, you begin building a new life, but from completely different consciousness than your old life. New career, new relationships, new home, new routines, all aligned with who you've become rather than who you were. And this rebuilding is slow, uncertain, and requires trusting something you can't yet see. Think about the life you're leaving. It was built from ego consciousness, achievement, status, approval, security. But your awakened consciousness doesn't care about those things. It cares about authenticity, meaning, alignment, truth. So you can't just modify your old life. You have to build something entirely new. One of Jung's patients described this rebuilding. 3 years post-awakening, I finally started building new life, but I had no blueprint. Everything was guided by internal knowing rather than external models. New work that felt authentic even if it looked unsuccessful by old standards. New relationships based on genuine connection rather than need. New lifestyle that honored my consciousness even if it seemed strange to others. Jung said this rebuilding from awakened consciousness was the final stage. You're creating life that matches who you've become. This is what Jung meant by individuation completion. You've separated from collective consciousness, dismantled your conditioned life, integrated your shadow, and now you're building life that's uniquely yours, not copied from others, not meeting external expectations, but authentically aligned with your awakened consciousness. You'll recognize this phase if you're creating things that make no sense to others but feel deeply right to you. If you're building life based on internal guidance rather than external models. If what you're creating looks strange from outside but feels authentic from inside, this is the life that emerges from actual awakening. But there's one final thing that happens. The sixth aspect completes the picture. Jung's final observation. After all of this, the collapse, the void, the alienation, the integration, the rebuilding, you realize something profound. Awakening wasn't the destination. It was the starting point. The breakthrough you thought was completion was actually initiation into the real work of conscious living. Before awakening, you thought enlightenment was the end goal. Awaken and you're done. But Jung discovered that awakening is just the beginning of a completely different way of existing. You don't awaken and then coast. You awaken and then learn to live consciously every single day. And that conscious living is the actual practice. One of Jung's most developed patients described this realization. 5 years post-awakening, I finally understood. Awakening wasn't the finish line, it was the starting line. I'd thought I'd arrive somewhere. Instead, I'd been initiated into a way of being that requires daily practice. Conscious living isn't a destination you reach. It's a practice you engage with for the rest of your life. The awakening just made that practice possible. This is what Jung meant by lifelong individuation. You don't individuate and then you're done. You individuate and then you live from that individuation daily. The awakening opens the door. Walking through that door consciously every day is the actual work. And that work never ends. It just becomes your way of being. You'll recognize this if you've stopped looking for the next breakthrough. If you've realized that living consciously today is the practice. If you understand that awakening gave you tools, and now you use them daily, rather than seeking new tools. What really happens after spiritual awakening? Everything you built starts falling apart. Old structures can't be maintained from new consciousness. You lose your sense of self completely. Identity void, while authentic self forms. You become incompatible with your former life. Frequency change creates alienation. You enter a long integration phase, consolidating the consciousness shift. You slowly build new life from new consciousness, creating from authentic alignment. You realize awakening is the beginning, initiation into conscious living practice. Jung would want you to understand, if you're post-awakening and struggling, you're not doing it wrong. This is what actually happens. The marketed version of awakening, immediate peace, lasting bliss, enlightened life, that's fantasy. The real version is collapse, void, alienation, integration, rebuilding, and lifelong practice. Most people abandon their awakening during this phase because it looks nothing like what they expected. They think they failed, they chase the next experience. But Jung insisted, this difficult post-awakening process is where transformation actually happens. The breakthrough was dramatic but temporary. This integration is quiet but permanent. If you're post-awakening and your life is falling apart, you've lost yourself. You feel alienated. You're doing grinding integration work. You're slowly rebuilding. Jung would tell you, this is exactly what's supposed to happen. You haven't failed. You're succeeding in ways that aren't visible yet. The awakening experience broke you open. What you're experiencing now is learning to live from that opening, and that learning takes time, years sometimes. Don't abandon the process because it's hard. Don't chase the next awakening because integration isn't dramatic. Do the work of actually transforming rather than collecting experiences. Trust that something is forming beneath the surface chaos. Trust that the collapse is making space. Trust that the void is necessary. Trust that integration is real work, even if it's not exciting. Trust that rebuilding from new consciousness creates something better than anything you could have maintained from old consciousness. Awakening is the beginning. What comes after? This difficult, unglamorous, long process of integration and rebuilding. That's where you become the person the awakening revealed was possible. Stay with it. The transformation everyone promises happens here, in this phase nobody talks about. This is where genuine change occurs. Subscribe to explore Jung's insights on navigating post-awakening integration. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.